would be great.
Okay, great. So again, just want to thank Jeff and the whole team at Data for Good for having me today. I'm really excited to do my presentation. As some of you may know, I wrote a book called Bad Data. My presentation today is a little bit about some of the lessons and some of the stories from that book. It's kind of like the bad side to data. So it's kind of like the dark side, the pitfalls of it. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about it. The subtitle of the book is Why We Measure the Wrong Things and Miss the Metrics That Matter. And really, I talk about how sometimes we focus on the wrong things because we measure the wrong things and we kind of miss the things that are really important. And so just to start, I'm going to start with this quote. And this quote is from William Bruce Cameron. And it says, "Not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts." And I read this quote before I wrote my book, and actually it was an inspiration for my book. And I kind of kept it in mind throughout writing the book. And I think it's something that I think everybody can kind of learn from. This is, I think, a really profound saying here, especially when we get into data and metrics. Sometimes we get really fascinated by counting things and we kind of forget if they're important or not. And that's kind of what I want to explore here. And so I'm going to start with a story. And the story is about this British problem in India. And so in around the mid 1800s, the British colonial government in India had a problem with what you see on the screen here, cobras. In the capital city of Delhi, there was quite a few cobras living in the city. They're poisonous. They would bite people, and every once in a while, because they're poisonous, they can be deadly, and people would die. And so the British government came up with this idea that what they would do in order to address the cobra problem is they would put a bounty on the cobras. So they put this bounty on the cobras, and so if anybody returned a dead cobra to the British colonial office, they would get paid. They would get a reward for the dead cobra. And so this went on for quite some time, and a lot of people started returning dead cobras, and it looked like everything was going well. Lots of dead cobras, and the British thought, oh, we're solving the problem. It looks like we're getting a lot of cobras eliminated, and hopefully the problem's going away. But what happened is, pretty soon they learned, well, the reason why they were getting so much cobras is because some citizens of the city found out that if they were to just capture and then breed cobras, they could actually make a lucrative business, just basically breeding cobras and then killing them and then returning them for the bounty. And so once the British government learned about this, they thought, well, this is terrible. This is not what we had in mind. We didn't want people to start, cobra farming. And so what they did is they canceled the bounty. They said, no more bounty. You can no longer return snakes to us. We're not going to pay you for them. And then what happened is, because there's all these cobra farmers who had, these clandestine, cobra breeding grounds in their backyards and all these places, they had all these cobras now that were entirely worthless. And so more often than not, they just set them free. And then the population of cobras in the city of Delhi just exploded. And so you have this phenomenon where the British government tried to incentivize a certain type of behavior to get a certain result. And what actually happened was the exact opposite of what they wanted. It was entirely counterproductive. The cobra population exploded, and they had to pay out all these bounties. So they did not accomplish their goal. And this became known as the Cobra Effect. So a German economist studying this called it the Cobra Effect. And it's also sometimes known as Goodhart's Law. And Goodhart was, or I guess still is, an economist. He was studying monetary policy, and he was looking at how governments try to use things like money supply to influence monetary policy, whether it's inflation, deflation, or whatever. And he found out that really no matter what governments did, those actions would basically be anticipated and kind of counteracted by people like currency traders and others. And so he found that, no matter what targets you set or what measures you do, they kind of end up being counterproductive. And if it was really to summarize Goodhart's Law in a sentence, it's when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. And I want to just clarify something here in the point here of the presentation is I'm going to talk a lot about metrics. And metrics are a little bit different from data. in the sense that data or a measurement is just a quantifiable piece of information. So the temperature of the sun is a measurement, or the wind speed outside, that's a measurement. What a metric is a metric is a measurement with a goal or incentives attached to it. So it's things like test scores, you want to improve test scores, or profits, you want to improve profits. So think of metrics as any type of data that you want to change and you want to have a goal towards, you want to get to some goal or at least some direction in terms of it. So just in terms of Goodhart's law or the Cobra effect, this is really widespread. It happens everywhere in every type of business, every type of field of study. And I'll just give you some examples. So one is in China, some paleontologists, again, in the 1800s, were looking for some dinosaur fossils in this one area. And they decided to get the local population to help them. And so they gave them basically rewards. If they turned in dinosaur fossils, they'd give them a payment. They would basically pay them for finding a fossil. But what they did is they said, for every fragment of fossil you return to us, we'll pay you. And so the local peasants, what they would do is they would find a fossil in their field or in a riverbank or whatever, and then they would smash it. And they would smash it into multiple fragments, because when they went to the paleontologists, they can return multiple fragments for more money. Another really good example is in healthcare. In the state of New York, the state started to track and report on the success rates of surgeries for cardiac surgeons. So they would look at just percentage success rates for cardiac surgery. The idea here is that if they tracked success rates, then patients would choose to go to surgeons that had higher success rates, and it would incentivize surgeons to do better, to be more successful. That was the idea. What ended up happening is that experienced surgeons and better surgeons started to refuse to take on complicated cases. And the reason is because if they took on a complicated case, it would reduce their success rate. And so what happened is that complicated surgeries started going to much more junior, much less experienced surgeons. And the overall success rate of cardiac surgery dropped because you had complex surgeries going to people who were not prepared to deal with them, all because you're trying to incentivize individuals to increase their success rates. Another example is in the United Kingdom. Again, another healthcare example. This is where the National Institute of Health or National Health Service started tracking emergency rooms on the time it took for a patient that is admitted into the emergency room to be seen by a doctor. And so emergency rooms were tracked on this metric. And so what they would do is that when an ambulance pulled up with a patient, the admitting staff of the emergency room wouldn't let them unload the patient until a doctor was ready to see them, because they wanted to get that score really low. And what happened is it just basically created this backlog of ambulances waiting outside emergency rooms. Even though there's beds available in the emergency room, they kept them in the ambulances because they wanted to keep that score low. Another example, a really fun one, in Australia, train conductors were measured on whether or not, or the percentage of times that they completed their route on time. So you have multiple stops on a route. They want to make sure you completed that route within the allotted time. What would happen is train conductors would simply just skip stops, and especially they would skip busy stops, because busy stops means there's more time for boarding and alighting of passengers. So they would just skip them so that they can make their route on time, but then a whole bunch of passengers are just left waiting at stations. And then finally, an example that's actually still quite common is a lot of call centers that do technical help and customer support. They're measured on something called average handling time. And this is the amount of time that a customer service representative spends on the phone with a customer, with the intention here of trying to reduce that number so that call centers can be more efficient, so that their overall costs are lower because people are spending less time on the phone. And what ends up happening a lot of times with these call centers that have high incentives to decrease average handling time is that the customer service representatives simply just hang up on people, or they just tell them, just restart your computer, and then they hang up. Because if they do that, they can keep their average handling time low. So all of these examples really point out to this paradox of metrics, is that often we use metrics with this intention of trying to improve something. We try to increase or an outcome or achieve a certain outcome. But because of the way we structure the metric, we actually get something that's entirely counterproductive. So this is just kind of a restatement of Goodhart's law, the Cobra Effect. And I want to talk about essentially two ways that I identify in my book, or at least two of the ways that people learn to game the system, that they learn to game metrics. And these two categories are, the first one is just manipulating the metric itself. And this really comes down to just finding ways to falsify data, changing numbers, or things like that. The second one is when they alter behavior and they focus solely on achieving the metric. Most of the examples I gave you before were that second one, where they were altering behavior. So they're, the people in the emergency room focusing just on the patient time from admittance to seeing a doctor and avoiding everything else. And I'm going to talk about a few examples about how this plays out in the real world. And then we can talk at the end about some lessons about how to try to avoid some of these pitfalls. So I want to start with a pretty big example, and one that's pretty prevalent across the world, and that's standardized tests. This is something that most primary and secondary school children go through. It's also pretty common in university settings. And I talk about this specific example that happened in the state of Atlanta from 1999 to 2009. And during that time, the superintendent of schools in Atlanta really put a lot of pressure to achieve test results. And they were using something called CRTC exams. You don't need to know what those are, but they're basically, they're standardized tests for various subjects for students across all grade levels. And what the superintendent did in this situation was implement rolling standards, so that every year what they did is they tracked all the scores for tests across all grades and across all the different subjects. And then they basically said, every year we expect those results to increase by 3%. So if you had your average test score was 54 one year, next year is 57, the year after it's 60, the year after it's 63, and so on and so forth. And tied to those standards were a lot of very high-powered incentives. So principals can get promoted to sub-superintendent, teachers can get promoted to principal. They would get cash bonuses at the end of their year, pretty significant ones. They'd have wage increases. There was a lot of recognition in terms of awards, ceremonies, they'd have a huge ceremony at the end of every year in their kind of main football stadium. Lots of really high pressured incentives to meet those goals. And then also some disincentives and punishments for not meeting them. So you could see your school lose its funding. You could see students be reassigned, staff reassigned to other schools, students reassigned to other schools. You could be fired, so you could be dismissed, or they could just close schools. And sometimes, or the state would come in and take over them. And because of all these incentives, it had a profound impact, especially on the principals employed in the Atlanta Public School District. Within 10 years, those 10 years, 1999 to 2009, 90% of principals were replaced. Either they left or they were fired or moved on in some other way. And when you first look at this, it was widely successful. Test scores across the board increased quite substantially. For instance, language arts, the 50% of people were making the minimum achievement. By 2009, it was 90%. But of course, my book is called Bad Data. And so this is not a good example, and you'll start to see why. But before I get into how it was going bad, I just want to point out that this whole situation in Atlanta was really a classic example of using key performance indicators to drive organizational behavior. And this happens in a lot of organizations and a lot of companies. They basically follow the same model. Is number one, you determine your key performance indicators. And in this case, it was test scores. Then you set standards for performance. So you set benchmarks and goals. And then you reward people for meeting that performance, or you punish them for not meeting it. And then what you see over time is that your KPIs improve, your test scores go up, everyone celebrates, everyone thinks everything's great. And, and of course, in this case, it wasn't. And it started to become evident when some journalists started looking at what was actually happening. And there was an article in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, which is their kind of main paper in Atlanta, where these journalists reported on two schools to start. They looked at two schools and they said, these two schools were allowed to do a rewrite. And that's something that the public school system let them do. If they wrote their tests in early spring and they didn't do well, they were allowed to rewrite and they were allowed to re-prepare. And what they found is that in these schools, in the springtime, when they wrote the tests, nearly half of the children failed the test. But when they rewrote it, nearly half failed, and they were in the lowest 10% of all schools in the state on their score. But then they rewrote that test later on, I think in early summer. And then not only did more than 50% pass, every single student passed. And not only that, they went from 10th percentile to 77th in just a few months. And then later, they looked at some other schools. One school whose test results put them in 830th in the state for math. So way in the back. The next year, that school was first. And then there were some really strange things happening as well. A lot of principals were finding that as students were coming into their junior high schools, so students moving from elementary to junior high, they would know the scores of those students because those were all published and everyone knew everyone's scores. And they'd find that these students who had really high achievement scores would come into the junior high and they could barely read. And so the question kind of came out, what's happening? And that's what the journalists said. They said, something's happening. We got to find out. And so they got the attention of the governor, and the governor ordered a special investigation. They used the Bureau of Investigation. They hired, I think, something like 50 investigators, a special prosecutor, all kinds of people. They were, and they did a very thorough investigation of what was happening. They were interviewing teachers. They were wiretapping teachers. They also hired a company to do something called erasure analysis, where you look at the changes in tests on multiple choice tests, where someone erases an answer to look at if they change them more often to a right answer than to a wrong answer. And what they found through this investigation was that 83% of schools in Atlanta were cheating. And then as a result of this investigation, initially 178 teachers, principals, and sub-superintendents, as well as the superintendent of schools for Atlanta, were all criminally charged with racketeering and other related charges. And this slide here is just showing you some of the outfall of that. It made national news, CNN, CBS, the paper here. You can see, a massive scandal that unfolded about just the level of cheating that was happening in these schools. And I want to talk a little bit about how they cheated. So first of all, teachers would actually just go in and they'd steal the tests that they brought to the schools by the test administrators. They'd steal the tests, and then they would go and they would teach those the exact questions to their students. And so one teacher would go and get a copy of the test, they'd photocopy it, give it out to all the other teachers, and the teachers would just literally teach their students those exact questions and the exact answers. And they tell them this question, the answer is 7, or this question, the answer is whatever. Another thing they would do is that once the students had written the tests and they were, put somewhere to be graded, and before the person who was administering the test got them, the teachers would sneak into a room together, and then they would go through the tests and they would change wrong answers to right answers. And this is how they were caught with the erasure analysis, that they found that it was, incredibly improbable that many questions were changed from wrong to right and not the other way around. And then also the teachers would focus only on the material that they knew would be on the test, and they would ignore everything else. And so they wouldn't teach their students, things in the curriculum that weren't on the tests, or when students brought up, other questions about learning about, things that are related or just things that they were interested in, the teachers would just be like, nope, we are talking about, this question or this particular material because it's on the test. And you're probably asking yourself, why did so many teachers cheat? And it was widespread. It was 83% of schools, hundreds and probably thousands of teachers and principals who were cheating. And the reason why is because if they didn't cheat, they would lose their jobs. They would be fired. People who, or even people who, tried to blow the whistle, they were relocated, they were fired. Their schools would close. And it was especially hard because everybody was cheating and because they had rolling standards, it was impossible not to cheat because there was no way you could get, your junior high student who could barely read to all of a sudden score an 87% on a test because the year before did that. And so this is just one very extreme example of how basically people learn to game the system. And this one is obviously bordering criminal. But you can see that there's two ways that they were trying to basically manipulate the metric and make those results. The first one is manipulating the metric itself. So this is tampering with tests. This is actually changing answers. This is the things like stealing the tests. And then there's also the altering behavior. And so this is when the teachers would only teach material to the students that was on the test. And so we'll talk about some of the lessons about this particular example in the end here, but I just want to point out that there's kind of two different ways that people manipulate the metrics and kind of game the system. Another kind of example I want to talk about is something called corporate short-termism. And this happens a lot in the business world. And in a lot of companies, executives have incentives that are really tied to things like earnings per share or stock price or things like that. And those incentives tend to be things like stock options. They tend to be things like bonuses, and they're really tied to those things. And so how do executives find ways to increase their earnings? And again, the idea here is that, if we give incentives to our executives to increase share price, they're going to increase share price. They're going to find efficiencies in the company. They're going to do all these things that benefit shareholders, that benefit the company in the long term because we've given them incentives. But what actually happens is usually pretty counterproductive. And it's called corporate short-termism for a reason. So again, we have two different categories. We have ways to manipulate the actual metric and then ways to change behavior. So the manipulating the metric here is if anybody is in accounting, you've probably heard the term earnings management. And earnings management is, as briefly as I can put it, is finding ways to manipulate accounting practices to show earnings that are different, usually greater, that are greater than were actually realized. Earnings management is often a dirty word in accounting because a lot of times earnings management is borderline fraud. And a lot of the large corporate scandals, things like Enron, those were basically earnings management scandals. They were situations where the companies were reporting earnings that they didn't actually realize, and they were finding ways through the accounting system to kind of make things look a lot better than they actually were. But the other thing that a lot of executives do, and probably more widespread and actually probably more detrimental to the business, is what's called corporate short-termism. And what this is in business, this is where executives do things where they basically get their earnings up, they get their stock prices up, but they do so in the short term and they sacrifice the long term. And typically this is things like they'll cut their marketing department and they'll cut research and development because those two things won't have any impact on earnings in the short term, but they are absolutely detrimental to a business in the long term. If you are not able to keep up with technology, with your competitors, you will lose out and you will no longer be a company and you will lose out to your competitors. But in the short term, you could actually increase your earnings and look really good in this situation. So again, two ways that you can manipulate the metrics. One is actually change the numbers. The other one is change your behavior so you're focusing only on the things that are being measured. Another example here I want to talk about is in the world of police. And so this example is kind of in the 1990s. Police forces across the US and starting in New York started using crime statistics as methods to evaluate performance. And they used something called CompStat. And in my book, I have a whole chapter on CompStat and this, but but essentially what they would do is they would track crime data by different precincts. And so they look at things like what are called index crimes, so murders, robbery, assault, things like that, as well as misdemeanors. And they basically track those by precinct and then give incentives to precinct commanders to achieve those metrics. Again, promotions, bonuses, all those types of things, all the way down to, you know, your kind of street patrol officer. Everyone's given incentives or pressure to kind of make these things happen. As well, they weren't just looking at crime data, they were also tracking enforcement action. So how many arrests did you write? You know, I mean, sorry, how many arrests did you make? How many tickets did you issue? Those types of things. And so similar to Atlanta is over like a 10-year period in New York, crime rates look to just drop substantially. But just like the Atlanta public school system, when people started looking more and more at what was actually happening in New York with crime, is it wasn't as good as it was reported. And what was happening essentially is that police officers were again doing two things. First of all, they were manipulating the metrics. So they're finding ways to report crime differently so that it didn't, you know, it didn't come across as bad. So this is called downgrading crime. So if someone gets assaulted and robbed, the police record that as lost property. So instead of having a felony assault and you have what's called an index crime, you just have a misdemeanor. You just have lost property. You have also practices where the police would make it very difficult for people to report crime. So a person couldn't report crime to an officer on the street, they'd have to go into the station. And if it's a certain type of crime, they couldn't report it at that station, they had to go downtown to another station. And so they put all these barriers in place to prevent people from reporting crimes because they wanted to keep the reported crime rate really low. On top of that, what else they would do is, in order to get their numbers up for the enforcement actions, is they started to do things like unlawful searches. And if people are aware of or know about the stop and frisk scandal in New York, where police officers would often stop people, and typically young African and Latino males, and do unlawful searches on them. And they would also do things like they would just falsify reports. They would just make up names. They would just make up tickets because they wanted to show that they were doing all these things when in fact it wasn't happening. And again, there's the other part of this. This behavior is not just changing the metrics, is actually altering behavior. And so this is where the police start to shift their focus from what's called community policing, which is, you know, focusing on the environment of safety in the community, focusing on building relationships with people in the community. And they start to focus on just giving out tickets, you know, issuing summons. And basically the police and the community start to have a very negative relationship, because the police are almost looking at their community as a group to, you know, issue tickets to, and who when they do come to the police for help, the police don't want to help them, because if they help them, they have to report a crime. And so they often are trying to get people to not report crimes. And so you have this very adversarial relationship, and that's really changing the nature and the behavior of the police force in these cities. Okay, so that was a lot of examples of some pretty intense situations where metrics are being manipulated. But there's lessons there. And here's just a few of the lessons from my book, and some of the lessons kind of related to how we use metrics. The first one is, as much as you can, avoid using metrics as incentives. Don't incentivize behavior based on metrics. Instead of using them as incentives, use them as what I call program evaluation. Instead of, you know, giving somebody, a bonus or reward or punishment for meeting something, use it to just look at how the system is working, and if you need changes to that system or that program. The more you put incentives on, especially incentives on individuals, the more you're going to get that metric manipulation, the more you're going to get people who focus only on the stuff that is measured and ignore everything else. That's probably the biggest lesson is try to avoid incentives as much as possible. It's very counterintuitive because almost any program, any KPI program, that's the first thing we say is let's develop KPIs and then let's give people incentives for achieving them. My advice is never do that. What you end up getting is people who either just make up numbers or find ways to change the numbers, or they just do the thing you want them and they forget and they just ignore everything else. And typically they're going to do something that's very counterproductive. If you have to measure people and incentivize people, it's as much as you can, try to separate who's actually reporting the metrics and who's being incentivized on the metrics. So in the case of the New York Police Department, police officers were responsible for reporting crime, and they were also incentivized on what the crime rate was. And so they had this massive incentive to just never report crimes or downgrade them. You should have a separate reporting system for crime. You should have a separate group that actually tracks crime and tracks and does intake of crime, and not the people who are being who are supposed to enforce it or reduce it. Another thing is more often than not, you should be focused on long-term, what I call outcome-based metrics. A lot of short-term metrics, such as things like earnings per share for the particular quarter you're in, or just things like enforcement action. They're very short-term. They're very activity-focused, and they don't necessarily lead to good outcomes in the long term. So as much as you can, avoid short-term metrics, avoid activity-based metrics. Focus on outcome. And then finally, a really important point here is you should be using a variety of metrics. And the reason why is that there's no single metric that can capture, everything that you're trying to do in an organization. And often we look for this. We look for like, what's the key performance indicator, or what's the one thing I need to focus on? And I would advise against that. You actually have to look at a lot of different metrics, because you need to understand how they're interplaying with each other. And how emphasizing one could actually lead to a decrease in the other, and so those are all the lessons I have in this presentation. I appreciate it's not a very long presentation; it's a long book, but I just wanted to give you some examples of where metrics go wrong and maybe some lessons we can learn from them. And then just a repeat here of that quote I started with: "Not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts." Really important to kind of just remember that as you go on. And finally, just a little pitch here. That's my book called Bad Data. It's in pretty much most bookstores. I would check availability for things like chapters, because sometimes they don't have copies, but there's a few, I think, in the city. And then it's also on places like Amazon as well, if you'd like to order it. So thanks a lot. And I'd be happy to have a great discussion with this.
Yeah, well, that's great, Peter.
Stop
thanks.
Sharing here.
Yeah, thanks so much. Really a fascinating, fascinating content. So highly recommend the book. A few comments in the chat. One comment is, we all optimize from maximum utility, no matter what the situation is, because it's kind of human nature. And some of your examples were in governments and that sort of thing, and it happens a lot in business, as you kind of alluded to as well. I guess I would just comment on, in the nonprofit sector, right? We have issues as well so you think about the relationships between funders and organizations that are getting the funding, right? It's a power relationship.
Yep.
And oftentimes in those funding agreements, the nonprofits are forced to come up with metrics or KPIs or whatever. And those may not be the right ones to deliver maximum social benefit, but they're the ones that they're going to focus on.
Yep.
So that they can get additional funding. Like I'm not trying to suggest that there's a whole bunch of nefarious things going on, but it comes back to, it's actually human nature to do some of these things. Right?
Yeah, and everybody does this, and that's the thing. I think the lesson of my book and this presentation is that this is everywhere. It's not just police officers. It's not just teachers. Not just healthcare. There's not a single field that this type of behavior isn't happening. There's a question in the chat that I want to talk about.
Sure.
Someone said, how do you view the phrase, what gets measured gets done? And that's great, because I talk about that in my book. And so there's a quote by this person named Peter Drucker, and it was, what gets measured gets managed. And a lot of people interpret that to say, oh, so we had to measure things so that we can manage them. And they don't understand is that when Peter Drucker said that, it wasn't a quote to say this is a good thing, this is a goal. It was a warning. He was saying what you measure, and when he says gets managed, he means gets manipulated. It gets focused on, and it gets this behavior. And so what's really interesting is a lot of people think that they say, oh, what gets measured gets managed, therefore let's measure these things. And he's like, no. That's the opposite. You got to be very careful about what you measure, because it'll get managed. It'll get, you'll get the numbers, but not in the ways that you expect. So yeah, great question there.
Yeah. So there's another question, kind of what motivated you to write the book? Was it your job, or was it an article, or you just got fed up by kind of examples?
Yeah, it's interesting. So that quote from, I forgot his name now. I used to think it was Einstein, but not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. That was part of it. But actually what started it was when I was in grad school for urban planning, I learned about congestion metrics and how we measure congestion.
Yeah. And
I found out when I was reading about it, I'm like, it's entirely backwards. We measure the opposite thing. We basically reward behavior that's causing the problem. And from there, I was like, oh, I should look more into, are there other metrics that are, kind of perverse? And then I found out that almost every metric is perverse. And the problem with writing this book, and I see people here who read it, is you read this book and then you see it everywhere. And you see almost anything you look at, any piece, any metric, you're like, oh my, this is counterproductive. Yeah.
A good question. Do you think data literacy plays a role in government and corporations? Can that is that a factor, and can those organizations help to eliminate some of this just through data literacy?
Yeah, I think data literacy is really important, and especially just the idea that you need to understand what the measurements actually mean. Because a lot of time what happens is we just focus on a metric or a measurement and we just say, well, it's going up, this is great, and we don't think about how it relates to other things, or why it goes up, or just I guess numeracy and data literacy in general. Just like I have like a small section of the book just talking about, like, you need to have a denominator a lot of times, because a lot of times we just talk about things and don't talk about them per capita. It'll be like, oh, there's this many murders in this, this city versus this city. And you're like, well, this city's population is 10 times this city's population. Like just that basic idea of using denominators escapes people. So it definitely helps. And I would say the more people learn about metrics, and of course, buy my book, the better they'll know how to kind of spot those kind of things.
Yeah, for sure. I think data literacy does play a big role. The other thing I think, and it's a little bit hidden, is data quality. Right? And I don't think, and a lot of times when we work with nonprofit organizations in our projects or our datathons, we spend a lot of time looking at data quality, because it's garbage in, garbage out, right? And if you don't do some of that sensing about data quality, then nothing really matters.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And a big part of the New York Police Department scandal was that the data was all garbage, right?
Yeah.
Like they were just making things up. They were downgrading crimes, and they didn't have anybody to actually audit it. And once they started auditing it, and you had investigators follow up with people about crimes they reported, they'd find out it's like, this is not what they reported at all. And so it is really important. And again, because if you don't have those checks and balances, you get people who manipulate the data. And that's why it's important to have that separation, however that is, whether it's an audit, whether it's someone else recording the information that has no incentives. But the biggest thing is, it's more important to have data that's like truthful than any rewards or anything about it. We need to talk about the truth, and not just the made up numbers that we use to make ourselves look good.
Right. So your book came out a couple of years ago, I think. So it's kind of been in the wild. One of the questions is, have you been able to influence the city of Calgary in some of their practices around data and measuring what matters.
I've had a few meetings with different groups in the city, just talking about mostly just talking about Goodhart's law, right? Talking about how data gets manipulated, but then also some other, there's a few other lessons I have in my book that I didn't talk about today because there's only so much time, but things like measuring outcomes versus activities, things like using a denominator, things like balancing metrics, those are important. And I think just in general, just once you like read the book, you start to be able to pick out the errors in a lot of metrics to say, okay, well, that's an activity-based metric, or that one doesn't have any denominator, it's just a gross metric. And so things like that definitely help, and I think people kind of learn from that.
I mean, we've heard the stories about kind of lying with statistics, and there's a comment about sort of analytics and visualizations, right? The thing about not starting the axis at zero, right? Or having these logarithmic bands when you're expecting normalized bands, like all that sort of stuff. So any comments on that aspect of it?
That stuff's really important. I would say my book's not about that. I mean, I'm more about there's a lot about visualization or getting the data, the correct data, but I'm all about, my question is, are you measuring the right thing? And we don't ask that enough, because we just find something that we can measure and the data is easily accessible, and we say, okay, we'll just use that, instead of saying, well, what are we actually trying to figure out? What are we actually trying to measure? And that's what we need to measure, and not just the easiest thing that's measured or the most accessible thing.
Fantastic. So I think we'll go out on this question. Are you writing the next book, and what's it about?
I'm started to write a new book. It's on a totally different topic. It's on our relationship and understanding of nature and what's natural, and whether natural is good or bad, and how we think about it. It's a very big topic, but that's kind of where I am right now. It's probably going to change several times.
Right. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, thanks so much, Peter. It's been just a joy to have you. And you're a Calgarian, so we kind of know where to find you. And
I'm here.
Folks find your book, and then maybe they'll get a signature. Get you to sign it for them as well.
Yeah, if they can track me down, I'll sign your book if you can find me. Send me a message on LinkedIn or something like that. I'll definitely sign books.
All right. So thanks, Peter, and everybody else for joining us. So our next meetup will be Thursday, April 28th, the fourth Thursday of the month. So put that in your calendar. We haven't posted it yet. We will post it through Meetup, so you'll get that notice. So thanks again to the pet adoption micro project. That was great, a great piece of work. And we're looking forward to the other projects to present as well. So have a good night. Take care, and we'll see you in April. Bye now.
Thanks again, everyone.